A small-framed woman, barely 5 feet tall, standing among towering soldiers who snicker behind her back. They call her too weak, a liability, someone who doesn't belong on the battlefield. But what they didn't know was that this woman would soon rewrite the very definition of strength, carrying 8 wounded soldiers to safety through a hellscape of enemy gunfire, proving that true courage has nothing to do with size. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her name was Elena Kozlova, though most people just called her Little Lena. Born in 1921 in a small Ukrainian village, Elena grew up during some of the most turbulent times in European history. Her childhood was marked by poverty, political upheaval, and the constant threat of war looming over her homeland. While other girls her age were learning to cook and sew, Elena was helping her father repair farm equipment and learning to shoot rabbits for dinner when food was scarce. Elena's father, Dmitri, had served in the Great War and returned home with stories that both fascinated and terrified his young daughter. He would tell her about the trenches, the mud, the screaming of artillery shells overhead, and the bonds forged between soldiers who depended on each other for survival. But more importantly, he taught her that bravery wasn't about being the biggest or the strongest. It was about doing what needed to be done, even when every fiber of your being screamed at you to run. "Little bird," he would say to Elena as they sat by the fire on cold winter nights, "the sparrow doesn't fear the eagle because it knows something the eagle doesn't. That survival isn't about size, it's about heart." These words would prove prophetic, though neither father nor daughter could have imagined just how literally they would come to pass. Elena's small stature, she never grew taller than 4 feet 11 inches, made her an easy target for ridicule. In school, the boys would tower over her, making jokes about how she could barely reach the top shelf in the classroom. The girls weren't much kinder, often excluding her from their social circles because she preferred climbing trees and catching fish to discussing fashion and boys. But Elena's size came with unexpected advantages. She was incredibly quick and agile, able to squeeze through spaces that would trap larger people. Her small frame required less food and water, making her naturally suited for situations where resources were limited. Most importantly, people consistently underestimated her, a trait that would serve her well in the years to come. When Elena turned 18 in 1939, the world was already sliding toward the abyss of World War II. The Soviet Union was making territorial grabs, Nazi Germany was flexing its military might, and Elena's village found itself caught in the crosshairs of history. Young men from her community were being conscripted into the Red Army, and stories began filtering back about the brutal realities of modern warfare. It was during this time that Elena made a decision that shocked everyone who knew her. Instead of staying home to tend to her aging parents or finding a husband, as was expected of young women in her village, she announced her intention to join the military. The reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. "Don't be ridiculous, Elena," her mother pleaded. "You're barely bigger than a child. What could you possibly do in the army?" Her neighbors were even less diplomatic. "They'll send her home the first day," one elderly woman muttered. "She'll probably get blown over by the wind from the first artillery shell." The local military recruitment office initially refused to even consider her application. The gruff sergeant behind the desk took one look at Elena's slight frame and burst into laughter. "Little girl," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "the army isn't a place for someone like you. Go home and find yourself a nice husband." But Elena had inherited more than just her father's wisdom. She had also inherited his stubborn streak. She returned to the recruitment office day after day, wearing down the resistance of the officials with her persistence. She demonstrated her marksmanship skills, her ability to navigate difficult terrain, and her surprising physical endurance. Most importantly, She argued that her size would make her valuable for reconnaissance missions and other specialized roles, where a smaller profile would be an advantage. After weeks of persistence, and with the military desperate for volunteers. As the war intensified, Elena was finally accepted into the Red Army. She was assigned to a medical unit, partly because the commanders assumed she would be better suited for women's work, like nursing, and partly because they genuinely didn't know what else to do with her. The training camp was brutal for everyone, but for Elena, it was particularly challenging. The standard issue uniforms had to be extensively altered to fit her small frame. The rifles were nearly as tall as she was, making weapons training an exercise in creative problem-solving. Her fellow trainees, mostly men from rural backgrounds, who had never served alongside women, ranged from protective to dismissive to openly hostile. "Look at little Lena struggling with that rifle," one soldier would joke during training exercises. "Maybe we should get her a slingshot instead." The physical demands of military training pushed Elena to her limits. Long marches with full packs left her exhausted, and she had to work twice as hard as the men to meet the same physical standards. But she persevered, driven by a combination of patriotic duty, personal pride, and the nagging determination to prove that she belonged. Elena's first real taste of combat came sooner than anyone expected. In June 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history, with over 3 million troops pouring across the Soviet border. Elena's medical unit was rushed to the front lines as part of the desperate Soviet attempt to halt the German advance. The journey to the front was Elena's first real glimpse of war's devastating reality. Their transport convoy passed through towns that had been reduced to rubble, filled with refugees carrying whatever possessions they could manage. The roads were clogged with retreating Soviet forces, many of them wounded, demoralized, and running low on supplies. The air was thick with smoke from burning buildings and the constant rumble of artillery in the distance. Elena's medical unit was assigned to the 47th Infantry Division, which was tasked with defending a strategically important bridge crossing over the Dnieper River. The position was considered crucial because it represented one of the last major obstacles preventing German forces from advancing deeper into Soviet territory. If the bridge fell, an entire sector of the front would collapse, potentially allowing German forces to encircle thousands of Soviet troops. The division's commanding officer, Colonel Vasily Petrov, was a veteran of the Finnish War who had earned a reputation for both tactical brilliance and genuine concern for his men's welfare. When Elena was introduced to him, his reaction was typical of what she had come to expect from military commanders. "They sent me a child?" he asked, looking Elena up and down with barely concealed disbelief. "What am I supposed to do with someone who can barely carry a stretcher?" Elena had learned to let such comments roll off her back, but this time she decided to respond. "With respect, sir, I've carried plenty of stretchers during training, and I can get into places that bigger soldiers can't reach." Colonel Petrov raised an eyebrow at her directness but said nothing more. He assigned Elena to work with the division's senior medic, a grizzled veteran named Sergei Volkov, who had been patching up wounded soldiers since the revolution. Volkov was initially skeptical of his new assistant, but he quickly discovered that Elena had several unexpected advantages. Her small size allowed her to treat wounded soldiers in cramped bunkers and collapsed buildings where larger medics couldn't maneuver. She was remarkably calm under pressure, never flinching when artillery shells exploded nearby or when she had to treat gruesome wounds. Most importantly, she seemed to have an intuitive understanding of battlefield medicine, quickly learning to prioritize the wounded who could be saved over those who were beyond help. "The little one has steady hands," Volkov grudgingly admitted after watching Elena successfully remove shrapnel from a soldier's chest under less than ideal conditions. "And she doesn't panic when the shooting starts." Elena's unit spent several weeks in relative quiet, treating the usual assortment of training injuries, minor wounds, and illnesses that plagued any military force. She began to earn the grudging respect of some of the soldiers, who appreciated her gentle bedside manner and her ability to procure extra medical supplies through creative bartering with other units. But the calm was deceptive. German forces were methodically working their way through Soviet defensive positions, using their superior tactics and equipment to overcome determined, but often poorly coordinated resistance. Intelligence reports indicated that a major German assault on their position was imminent, and the entire division began preparing for what everyone knew would be a desperate fight. The attack came at dawn on a foggy morning in late July. Elena was awakened by the thunderous roar of German artillery, a sound unlike anything she had ever experienced. The ground shook so violently that she could barely stand, and the air filled with dust and debris from exploding shells. Within minutes, their field hospital, which had been set up in a partially destroyed farmhouse, was under direct fire. "Everyone to the bunkers!" Colonel Petrov shouted over the noise of the bombardment. "This is it!" Elena grabbed her medical kit and followed the other medical personnel into the reinforced bunker that served as their emergency treatment center. The bombardment continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes. When it finally stopped, the sudden silence was almost as terrifying as the noise had been. "Get ready," Sergei whispered to Elena as they crouched in the bunker. "This is when they'll come." The German infantry assault began with the methodical precision that characterized Wehrmacht tactics. German soldiers, supported by tanks and armored vehicles, advanced across the open ground leading to the Soviet positions. The Soviet defenders dug into hastily prepared trenches and fortified buildings, opened fire with everything they had. Elena's first casualty arrived within minutes of the fighting starting. A young soldier, barely older than herself, had been hit by machine gun fire in both legs. As she worked to stop the bleeding and stabilize his wounds, she could hear the battle raging above ground, the chatter of machine guns, the explosion of grenades, and the shouted orders of officers trying to coordinate their defense. More wounded soldiers were brought to the bunker in rapid succession. Elena found herself working frantically alongside Sergei and the other medics, treating wounds that were far more severe than anything she had encountered during training or in the quiet weeks since arriving at the front. Shrapnel wounds, bullet holes, severe burns from exploding shells. The bunker quickly filled with the groans of wounded men and the metallic smell of blood. Despite the chaos around her, Elena discovered that she had an almost supernatural ability to remain calm and focused. While other medics became rattled by the severity of the wounds or the proximity of the fighting, she methodically worked through each casualty, making split-second decisions about treatment priorities and managing to save soldiers who might have died under less competent care. As the battle intensified above ground, Elena began to realize that this wasn't going to be a typical engagement. The volume and intensity of the German attack suggested that they were facing a major assault, possibly involving an entire German division. The Soviet defensive positions, while well prepared, were being systematically destroyed by German artillery and airstrikes. "We're being overrun," one soldier gasped as he was brought into the bunker with a severe head wound. "They're already past the first line of trenches." Elena continued working on her patients, but she could hear the fighting getting closer. The sound of German voices could occasionally be heard between explosions, indicating that enemy soldiers were advancing through the defensive perimeter. Colonel Petrov appeared in the bunker entrance, his uniform torn and covered in dust. "We're falling back to the secondary positions," he announced. "All non-essential personnel need to evacuate immediately." Sergei looked up from the soldier he was treating. "What about the wounded? We have 8 men who can't be moved." "Do what you can," Petrov replied grimly. "But we can't hold this position much longer." This was the moment that would define Elena's legend. As the other medical personnel began preparing to evacuate with the retreating Soviet forces, she made a decision that shocked everyone present. Instead of following the evacuation order, she announced that she would stay with the wounded soldiers who couldn't be moved. "Don't be insane, Elena," Sergei protested. "If you stay here, you'll be captured. Or killed. These men are too badly wounded to survive anyway." Elena looked at the 8 wounded soldiers lying on stretchers around the bunker. 3 had severe leg wounds that made walking impossible. 2 had been hit by shrapnel in the chest and were struggling to breathe. 1 had taken a bullet in the spine and was paralyzed from the waist down. Another had suffered severe burns over much of his body. The 8th soldier had multiple wounds and was drifting in and out of consciousness. "They're still alive," Elena said simply. "And I'm not leaving them." Sergei stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head. "You're either the bravest person I've ever met or the most foolish. Probably both." He pressed his remaining medical supplies into Elena's hands and disappeared up the bunker steps. Within minutes, Elena could hear the sounds of the Soviet retreat vehicle starting up, shouted orders to fall back, and the gradual diminishing of return fire from the defensive positions. Elena found herself alone in the bunker with 8 wounded soldiers, most of whom were barely conscious. Above ground, she could hear German voices getting closer as enemy troops methodically cleared the abandoned Soviet positions. She knew it was only a matter of time before German soldiers discovered the bunker and its occupants. But Elena had a plan, one that seemed impossible to everyone except her. She had noticed during her weeks at the position that there was a network of drainage ditches and old farm irrigation channels that ran from the defensive area toward the river. The channels were partially collapsed and filled with debris, making them impassable for normal-sized people. But Elena's small stature might allow her to navigate through them. More importantly, she had realized something that the larger, stronger soldiers around her had missed. The 8 wounded men, while unable to walk or fight, were still relatively light due to their injuries and the weight loss that came with combat stress. Elena calculated that she might be able to carry them one by one through the drainage system to safety. It was an audacious plan that bordered on the impossible. The drainage channels extended for nearly 2 miles through territory that was now controlled by German forces. Elena would have to make 8 separate trips, each time carrying a wounded soldier through a route that was barely wide enough for her small frame. She would have to do this while avoiding German patrols, dealing with unstable terrain, and managing soldiers who were in severe pain and possibly dying. But Elena had spent her entire life being told that things were impossible for someone her size. She had learned to ignore such assessments and focus on what actually needed to be done. "Listen to me," she whispered to the wounded soldiers who were still conscious. "I'm going to get you out of here. It's going to hurt, and it's going to be dangerous, but I need you to trust me." One of the soldiers, a sergeant named Pavel who had been hit in both legs, looked at her with disbelief. "Little Lena, you can't carry us. You're too small." Elena smiled grimly. "Pavel, how many times have people told me I'm too small for something? And how many times have I proven them wrong?" She began preparing for what would become one of the most extraordinary rescue operations in military history. Elena gathered the remaining medical supplies, fashioned makeshift carrying harnesses from rope and equipment straps, and began planning her route through the drainage system. She knew that once she started, there would be no turning back. Either she would successfully carry all 8 soldiers to safety, or they would all die together in the attempt. Above ground, the sounds of the German occupation of the position were becoming more pronounced. She could hear vehicles moving around, soldiers shouting orders in German, and the occasional burst of gunfire as they cleared remaining pockets of resistance. Time was running out. Elena's first rescue attempt began at dusk, when the fading light would provide some cover, but still allow her to navigate the treacherous drainage system. She had decided to start with Dmitri, a young private who had taken shrapnel in his chest but was still conscious and relatively stable. His smaller frame would make him easier to carry, and his alertness meant he could help by staying quiet and following her whispered instructions. "I'm going to get you out of here, Dmitri," Elena whispered as she fashioned a makeshift harness around his torso. "But you have to stay absolutely silent, no matter what happens. Can you do that for me?" Dmitri nodded weakly, his eyes reflecting both hope and terror. Elena had discovered a partially concealed entrance to the drainage system. At the back of the bunker, hidden behind collapsed sandbags and debris. The opening was barely wide enough for her shoulders, confirming her assessment that larger soldiers would never have been able to use this escape route. As she began to pull Dmitri through the narrow opening, Elena immediately realized that her plan, while theoretically possible, was going to be far more difficult than she had imagined. The drainage channel was filled with mud, debris, and stagnant water that came up to her knees. The walls were unstable, constantly threatening to collapse and trap them both. Worst of all, the route was not a straight line. It twisted and turned through the landscape, sometimes requiring her to navigate through spaces that were barely large enough for one person, let alone someone carrying a wounded soldier. But Elena had committed to this course of action, and she was not someone who gave up easily. Using a combination of pulling, carrying, and dragging, she began the slow, agonizing journey through the drainage system. Dmitri, true to his word, remained silent even when Elena had to pull him over sharp rocks or through particularly narrow passages that clearly caused him excruciating pain. The first challenge came about halfway through the route, when Elena heard German voices directly overhead. A patrol was moving through the area, their boots crunching on the debris-covered ground just feet above Elena and Dmitri's heads. Elena pressed herself and her patient against the muddy wall of the drainage channel, holding her breath as the German soldiers paused almost directly above them. "Anything down there?" one soldier asked in German, a language Elena had studied in school. "Just old farm drainage," another replied. "Too small for anyone to hide in." Elena almost smiled at the irony. The very size that had made her the target of ridicule was now saving their lives. The German soldiers moved on, never suspecting that 2 Soviet soldiers were hiding just beneath their feet. The remainder of the journey to the river took nearly 3 hours. Elena's small frame, while advantageous for navigating the narrow passages, meant that she had to rest frequently when carrying Dmitri's weight. Her shoulders ached, her back screamed in protest, and her hands were raw from pulling him over rough surfaces. But she persevered, driven by the knowledge that Dmitri's life depended on her success. When they finally reached the end of the drainage system near the river, Elena was exhausted but triumphant. She had successfully carried her first patient through enemy territory to safety. Soviet forces still controlled the area on the other side of the river, and Elena was able to signal to a patrol boat that ferried Dmitri to a field hospital. There was no time to rest or celebrate. Elena had 7 more soldiers waiting for her back in the bunker, and she knew that each subsequent trip would be more dangerous as German forces consolidated their control over the area. The journey back to the bunker was even more harrowing than the initial rescue. Elena was now moving alone through territory that was becoming increasingly saturated with German troops. She had to time her movements carefully, waiting in cramped hiding spots while patrols passed overhead, and taking detours when she encountered blocked passages or areas where the drainage system had collapsed. When she finally made it back to the bunker, she found the remaining wounded soldiers in worse condition than when she had left them. Without proper medical attention, their wounds were deteriorating, and several were beginning to show signs of infection and shock. "Elena," Pavel whispered when he saw her return. "We thought you were dead. Did you make it? Did Dmitri survive?" "He's safe," Elena replied, already preparing to take her next patient. But we need to move quickly. The Germans are everywhere, and this route is only going to get more dangerous. Her second rescue was Pavel himself, the sergeant with the wounded legs. Pavel was larger than Dmitri and in more pain, making him both harder to carry and more likely to make noise that could attract unwanted attention. Elena had to devise a new carrying technique, essentially dragging Pavel on his back while she crawled through the narrower sections of the drainage system. This journey was a nightmare of mud, pain, and terror. Pavel, despite his best efforts to remain quiet, couldn't suppress occasional groans when Elena had to pull him over particularly rough terrain. At one point, they encountered a section where the drainage channel had partially collapsed, leaving only a space about 18 inches high. Elena had to push Pavel through this gap while crawling on her belly, both of them covered in mud and barely able to breathe. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The second rescue took over 4 hours, significantly longer than the first due to Pavel's size and condition. By the time Elena delivered him to safety and made the return journey to the bunker, dawn was breaking, making further rescues exponentially more dangerous. German forces would now have full visibility of the area, and any movement would be much easier to detect. But Elena refused to abandon the remaining 6 soldiers. She had made a commitment, and she intended to honor it regardless of the personal cost. However, she realized that she would need to modify her approach. Daylight rescues would require even more careful timing and possibly longer rest periods between trips. Her third rescue was Victor, a machine gunner who had been hit by shrapnel in multiple locations. Victor was semi-conscious and delirious from blood loss, making him both lighter to carry and more unpredictable in his behavior. Elena was particularly worried that he might cry out or struggle during the journey, potentially alerting German patrols to their presence. This rescue became a test of Elena's ingenuity and patience. When Victor began to moan loudly during one particularly difficult passage, Elena had to make the split-second decision to temporarily sedate him using the last of her morphine supplies. It was a calculated risk. The morphine could help keep him quiet, but it could also depress his breathing and potentially kill him in his weakened state. The gamble paid off. Victor remained unconscious for most of the journey, allowing Elena to focus on navigation without worrying about noise. However, the morphine also made him completely dead weight, forcing Elena to essentially drag his entire body through the drainage system. By the time she reached the river, Elena's strength was nearly exhausted. The return journey after delivering Victor was when Elena first began to doubt whether she could complete her mission. Her body was breaking down from the physical strain. Her hands were bleeding from countless cuts and scrapes. Her back felt like it was on fire from the constant lifting and dragging. Most concerning, she was beginning to show signs of dehydration and exhaustion that could compromise her judgment and reaction time. But when she crawled back into the bunker and saw the 5 remaining soldiers, some barely clinging to life, Elena found reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. These men had trusted her with their lives, and she would not let them down. Her fourth rescue was Alexei, a communications specialist who had been burned over much of his upper body when his radio equipment exploded during the German bombardment. Alexei's injuries were particularly horrific, and Elena knew that every minute of delay reduced his chances of survival. She also knew that his burns made him extremely sensitive to contact, meaning that the journey would be agony for him. Elena devised a new carrying method for Alexei, using pieces of torn uniform to create padding between his burned skin and the rough surfaces of the drainage system. She also discovered that by moving more slowly and carefully, she could reduce the amount of painful contact while still making progress towards safety. This rescue became a lesson in the power of human compassion under extreme circumstances. Despite her own exhaustion and the constant threat of discovery, Elena found herself talking softly to Alexei throughout the journey, reassuring him that they would make it to safety and that his burns would heal. Her gentle voice seemed to calm him, and he managed to remain quiet even during the most painful portions of the escape route. When Elena delivered Alexei to the Soviet patrol boat, she noticed that the soldiers who received him looked at her with a mixture of amazement and disbelief. Word was beginning to spread about the small woman who was somehow managing to carry wounded soldiers through enemy territory to safety. How many more? The boat commander asked Elena as medics loaded Alexei onto a stretcher. 4, Elena replied, simply already preparing for her return journey. You can't keep this up, the commander said with genuine concern. You're going to collapse or get caught. Let us organize a proper rescue operation. Elena shook her head. By the time you organize anything, those men will be dead. I can do this. The return journey to the bunker was Elena's most dangerous yet. German forces had spent the day consolidating their control over the area, and the drainage route that had been relatively safe during the previous rescues was now intersected by multiple patrol routes. Elena had to spend hours hiding in cramped, water-filled sections while German soldiers moved overhead. At one point, she found herself trapped in a narrow section of the drainage system while a German squad set up a temporary checkpoint directly above her hiding spot. For over 2 hours, Elena remained motionless in knee-deep mud and stagnant water while German soldiers checked papers and questioned local civilians just feet above her head. When she finally made it back to the bunker, Elena found the situation had deteriorated significantly. One of the remaining soldiers, a young private named Boris, had died while she was gone. His death hit Elena harder than she expected, filling her with a desperate urgency to save the remaining 4 soldiers before it was too late. The loss of Boris also presented Elena with a practical problem. She couldn't leave his body in the bunker, both out of respect for the dead and because a German discovery of the bunker would compromise her entire operation. Elena made the difficult decision to carry Boris's body through the drainage system and deliver it to the Soviet forces, ensuring that he would receive a proper burial rather than being left in enemy territory. Carrying Boris's lifeless body through the drainage system was one of the most emotionally challenging experiences of Elena's mission. Unlike the wounded soldiers who could occasionally help by shifting their weight or following instructions, Boris was completely dead weight. More significantly, Elena had to confront the reality that despite her best efforts, she might not be able to save all the soldiers she had committed to rescuing. The journey with Boris took 6 hours, significantly longer than any of her previous trips. Elena's physical condition was deteriorating rapidly. She was dehydrated, exhausted, and suffering from numerous injuries sustained during her crawling through the rough drainage channels. Several times during the journey, she found herself on the verge of collapse, only managing to continue through sheer force of will. When she finally delivered Boris's body to the Soviet forces, Elena learned something that both encouraged and worried her. Her rescue efforts had not gone unnoticed by German forces. They were aware that someone was moving through their territory and had begun organizing systematic searches of the area. Elena's window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Elena, the Soviet patrol boat commander said urgently, German forces are conducting a major sweep of this entire sector. They know someone is operating behind their lines, and they're bringing in dogs and additional troops. You need to evacuate the remaining soldiers tonight, or you'll all be captured. Elena nodded grimly. She had already come to the same conclusion. The remaining 3 soldiers in the bunker, Mikhail, Ivan, and Sergei, would have to be rescued in rapid succession with minimal rest periods between trips. It would push Elena beyond her physical limits, but it was their only chance. Her 6th rescue was Mikhail, a tank crewman who had been pulled from his burning vehicle with severe leg injuries and burns. Mikhail was conscious but weak, and Elena could tell that he was beginning to lose hope. The psychological impact of waiting in the bunker while listening to German forces move overhead had taken a toll on all the remaining soldiers. "Elena," Mikhail whispered as she prepared him for transport. "If you can't make it, leave me behind. Save the others." Elena looked him in the eyes with fierce determination. "I'm not leaving anyone behind. We're all getting out of here." The journey with Mikhail was complicated by increased German patrol activity. Elena had to take several detours through even more cramped and dangerous sections of the drainage system, and at one point, she and Mikhail were forced to remain motionless for over an hour while German soldiers with dogs searched the area above them. The presence of the dogs was particularly terrifying. Elena knew that if the animals caught their scent, the entire rescue operation would be discovered. She had prepared for this possibility by covering herself and her patients with mud and stagnant water from the drainage channels, hoping to mask their human odor, but she couldn't be certain it would work. Fortunately, the thick mud and debris in the drainage system seemed to confuse the dog's ability to track scents. The German search party passed over Elena and Mikhail's hiding spot without detecting them. But the close call left Elena shaken and aware that her luck might not hold much longer. When she delivered Mikhail to safety, Elena learned that Soviet forces were planning a counterattack to retake the lost territory. However, the attack wouldn't begin for another 12 hours, meaning that Elena had to complete her final 2 rescues before dawn or risk being caught in the crossfire between opposing forces. Her 7th rescue was Ivan, a medic who had been wounded while treating other soldiers during the initial German assault. The irony was not lost on Elena. She was now rescuing someone whose job was to rescue others. Ivan's wounds were primarily to his arms and shoulders, making him easier to carry but also more aware of the danger they were both facing. "This is insane, Elena," Ivan whispered as she pulled him through a particularly narrow section of the drainage channel. "The odds of all of us making it out alive are practically zero." Elena paused in her efforts and looked back at Ivan. "Ivan, I've spent my entire life being told that the odds were against me. People said I was too small to be a soldier, too weak to be useful, too insignificant to make a difference. But here I am, proving them wrong one rescue at a time." Ivan managed a weak smile. "You know what? You're absolutely right. Let's prove them wrong together." The journey with Ivan proceeded more smoothly than the previous rescues, partly because Elena had now memorized every twist and turn of the drainage route, and partly because Ivan's medical training allowed him to better manage his own pain and movement during the escape. They made good time reaching the river, and Elena was able to deliver Ivan to safety with several hours of darkness remaining. But Elena's body was finally beginning to betray her. As she prepared for the return journey to collect the final soldier, Sergei, she realized that she was operating on pure adrenaline and willpower. Her hands were so damaged from crawling through rough passages that she could barely grip surfaces properly. Her legs were cramping from hours of awkward movement through confined spaces. Most concerning, she was becoming lightheaded from dehydration and exhaustion. The Soviet patrol boat commander took one look at Elena's condition and made a direct order. "Elena, you're done. You've already accomplished the impossible by saving 7 men. We'll organize a proper rescue operation for the last soldier." Elena shook her head stubbornly. "Sergei has been waiting just as long as the others. He deserves the same chance they got. I'm going back." "You'll die if you try another rescue in your condition," the commander argued. Elena smiled grimly. "Maybe, but Sergei will definitely die if I don't try." Against all medical advice and direct orders from her commanding officers, Elena began what would become her most perilous journey back to the bunker. Her body was operating beyond its normal limits, sustained only by an iron will and the knowledge that one more soldier, Sergei, the veteran medic who had been her mentor, was waiting for rescue in increasingly desperate circumstances. The return journey revealed just how much Elena's repeated trips had compromised the security of her escape route. German forces, now fully aware that someone was operating behind their lines, had intensified their search efforts. They had positioned guards at key intersections, installed listening posts along likely infiltration routes, and even begun pumping water into some sections of the drainage system to flush out any hidden enemies. Elena discovered the flooding when she was halfway back to the bunker. A section of the drainage channel that had been merely muddy on her previous trips was now filled with rapidly flowing water that came up to her chest. The Germans had diverted water from the river into the drainage system, creating a deadly trap for anyone attempting to use it as an escape route. For most people, this would have been an insurmountable obstacle. The current was strong enough to sweep away a full-grown man, and the water was cold enough to cause hypothermia within minutes. But Elena's small size, once again, provided an unexpected advantage. She was light enough to maintain her footing against the current, and her low center of gravity helped her stay stable as she slowly worked her way through the flooded section. The water slowed her progress significantly, and Elena realized that she was running out of time. Dawn was approaching, and German patrols would soon be operating with full visibility. Worse, she could hear the distant rumble of artillery, indicating that the promised Soviet counterattack was beginning earlier than expected. Elena and Sergei would soon be trapped between two opposing forces. When she finally reached the bunker, Elena found Sergei in critical condition. The veteran medic had been using his medical knowledge to keep himself alive, but his wounds were severe, and he had lost a dangerous amount of blood. Most concerning, he was barely conscious and might not be able to help during the rescue attempt. "Little Lena," Sergei whispered when he saw her, his voice barely audible. "You came back. I thought ... I thought you had given up on me." Elena knelt beside her mentor and checked his condition. Sergei's pulse was weak and irregular, his breathing was shallow, and his skin was cold and clammy, all signs of severe shock. Elena realized that this rescue would be different from all the others. Sergei might not survive the journey even under the best circumstances, and the route was now more dangerous than ever. "Sergei," Elena said softly, "I need you to listen to me. The drainage route is flooded, German patrols are everywhere, and our forces are beginning a counterattack. This is going to be the most difficult journey yet, and I need you to hold on no matter what happens." Sergei managed a weak smile. "You know, Elena, when I first met you, I thought you were too small and weak to be a combat medic. I was wrong about a lot of things, wasn't I?" Elena began preparing Sergei for transport, but she quickly realized that her usual methods wouldn't work. Sergei was too weak to help with his own movement, and the flooded drainage channel would require her to essentially swim while supporting his weight. She would need to devise an entirely new approach, using strips of fabric torn from uniforms and medical supplies. Elena created a makeshift flotation device that would help keep Sergei's head above water during the flooded sections of the journey. She also prepared waterproof wrappings for his most serious wounds, knowing that exposure to the contaminated drainage water could cause fatal infections. As Elena began the final rescue, she was acutely aware that this journey represented more than just saving one more soldier. Sergei had been her teacher, her protector, and the person who had believed in her capabilities when others doubted. Saving him would complete not just her mission, but also vindicate her belief that size and strength were less important than determination and courage. The journey through the flooded drainage system was a nightmare of cold water, treacherous currents, and the constant threat of discovery. Elena had to support Sergei's weight while navigating through chest-deep water that threatened to sweep them both away. At several points, she had to hold Sergei's head above water with one hand while using the other to pull them both through narrow passages that were barely wide enough for their bodies. The physical demands of the journey pushed Elena beyond what should have been humanly possible. Her muscles screamed in protest with every movement. Her lungs burned from the effort of breathing in the cold, humid air of the drainage system, and her vision began to blur from exhaustion and oxygen deprivation. Several times she nearly lost consciousness, only managing to stay alert through sheer force of will. But the most dangerous moment came when Elena and Sergei encountered a German patrol that had discovered one of the drainage system entrances. As Elena heard German voices and the splash of boots in the water behind them, she realized that enemy soldiers were actually inside the drainage system, searching for the mysterious infiltrator who had been rescuing Soviet soldiers. Elena found herself in an impossible situation. She and Sergei were trapped in a narrow section of the drainage channel with German soldiers approaching from behind and no clear escape route ahead. The water was too deep for Elena to move quickly, and Sergei was too weak to help with any evasive maneuvers. In desperation, Elena made a decision that saved both their lives but nearly cost her everything. She pushed Sergei into a small side channel that branched off from the main drainage route, then deliberately made noise to attract the German patrol's attention to her own location. Her plan was to lead the Germans away from Sergei, even if it meant sacrificing herself. Elena's desperate gambit to save Sergei by drawing the German patrol away from his hiding spot required her to make split-second decisions that would determine whether both of them lived or died. As she deliberately splashed through the water to create noise, Elena could hear the German soldiers quickening their pace behind her, their voices growing more excited as they realized they were closing in on their target. There! Something's moving up ahead. One of the German soldiers shouted in his native language. Elena's years of studying German in school now served her well, as she could understand exactly what the patrol was planning. They were going to try to corner her in a section where the drainage channel narrowed, cutting off any possibility of escape. Elena realized she had perhaps 5 minutes before they reached her position, using her intimate knowledge of the drainage system gained through 7 previous rescue missions. Elena began leading the German patrol on a deadly game of cat and mouse through the flooded channels. She would make just enough noise to keep them following her, then disappear into side passages or underwater sections that were too small for the larger German soldiers to navigate. The strategy worked, but it came at enormous personal cost. Elena was now moving through the most dangerous and unstable sections of the drainage system, areas she had previously avoided because of the risk of collapse or drowning. She was also moving away from the exit route toward the river, potentially trapping herself in enemy territory with no way to escape. After nearly an hour of this deadly chase, Elena managed to lose the German patrol in a maze of interconnected channels near an old mill foundation. The Germans, frustrated and convinced that their quarry had somehow escaped, eventually abandoned their search and returned to the surface. Elena waded in freezing water up to her neck for another 30 minutes to ensure they were truly gone before beginning the arduous journey back to where she had hidden Sergei. When Elena finally reached Sergei's hiding place, she found him unconscious and barely breathing. The cold water and stress of remaining motionless for so long had pushed his already weakened body to the edge of complete system failure. Elena realized that she had perhaps minutes to get Sergei to medical attention before he died. What followed was Elena's most heroic hour, a display of human endurance and determination that would be talked about for generations. Despite her own exhaustion, despite the increased danger from German patrols, and despite Sergei's deteriorating condition, Elena began the final push toward the river and safety. She could no longer carry Sergei in any conventional sense. Instead, she had to support his unconscious body while essentially swimming through the flooded drainage channels, using her legs to push off from the muddy bottom while keeping his head above water with her arms. Every few minutes she had to stop and check his pulse, sometimes performing basic resuscitation techniques to keep him breathing. The journey became a race against time on multiple fronts. Sergei's condition was deteriorating rapidly, the German search efforts were intensifying, and the Soviet counterattack was creating artillery strikes that were getting closer to Elena's position. At one point, A near miss from a Soviet shell caused part of the drainage system to collapse just behind Elena and Sergei, sealing off their retreat route and making escape their only option for survival. Elena's small size, which had been crucial for navigating the narrow drainage channels, now became a liability as she struggled to support Sergei's larger frame while moving through increasingly deep water. Several times she lost her footing, and both she and Sergei went completely underwater, forcing Elena to fight her way back to the surface while maintaining her grip on her unconscious patient. But Elena's determination never wavered, even as her own strength failed, even as hypothermia began to affect her judgment and coordination. She continued moving toward the river. She began talking to the unconscious Sergei, partly to keep herself alert, and partly because she believed that some part of him might still be able to hear her. "We're almost there, Sergei," she whispered through chattering teeth. "Just a little further. You taught me never to give up on a patient, and I'm not giving up on you." The final stretch of the journey required Elena to navigate through a section where the drainage channel had been damaged by artillery fire, creating a partially collapsed tunnel that was barely passable. Elena had to push Sergei through this obstacle while crawling on her belly through mud and debris, all while fighting off the effects of exhaustion and hypothermia. When Elena finally emerged from the drainage system near the river, she was met by a sight that filled her with both relief and amazement. Soviet forces, having learned of her incredible rescue mission, had positioned a full medical team at the exit point. Medics immediately took Sergei from Elena's arms and began emergency treatment to stabilize his condition. Elena collapsed the moment Sergei was taken from her arms. Her body, pushed beyond all reasonable limits, simply shut down. She had completed 8 rescues, carrying wounded soldiers through enemy territory under conditions that should have been impossible for someone of any size, let alone a woman barely 5 feet tall. As medics worked to treat Elena's hypothermia, dehydration, and numerous injuries, word of her achievement began to spread through the Soviet forces. Soldiers who had previously mocked her as Little Lena now spoke of her with awe and respect. Officers who had questioned her ability to serve in combat roles were forced to confront the reality that this small woman had accomplished something that none of them could have managed. But Elena's story was far from over. Her rescue of 8 soldiers through enemy territory would have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield, changing not just how people viewed her, but how they understood the very nature of heroism and courage. Elena's recovery from her ordeal took several weeks, during which time her story spread throughout the Soviet military and eventually to the highest levels of government. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save wounded comrades had evolved into a legend that challenged fundamental assumptions about gender, physical capability, and the nature of heroism itself. Colonel Petrov, Elena's commanding officer, was among the first to document her achievement officially. In his report to higher headquarters, he wrote, "Private Elena Kozlova has single-handedly accomplished what an entire rescue squad would have considered impossible. Her actions represent not just exceptional bravery, but tactical innovation of the highest order. She identified and exploited an escape route that no one else recognized, using her unique physical characteristics to overcome obstacles that would have stopped larger, stronger soldiers." The military significance of Elena's achievement extended beyond the immediate rescue of 8 soldiers. Her successful use of the drainage system demonstrated that small unit tactics could be effective even in situations where conventional military doctrine suggested hopelessness. Military strategists began studying her methods, looking for ways to apply her innovations to other combat situations. But it was the human story that captured people's imagination. Here was a woman who had been consistently dismissed as too weak and too small to be effective in combat, who had responded to that dismissal by accomplishing something that no one else could have done. Elena's rescue mission became a powerful symbol of how individual determination could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. When Elena was finally strong enough to be interviewed about her experience, her responses revealed the mindset that had made her achievement possible. "People kept telling me I was too small," she said simply. "But they never asked whether being small might actually be an advantage in certain situations. Sometimes the things that make you different are exactly the things that make you valuable." Elena's story reached the attention of Soviet leadership at the highest levels. Stalin himself took personal interest in the case, seeing an opportunity to demonstrate Soviet values of equality and individual heroism. Elena was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest military decoration, making her one of the youngest recipients in the award's history. The medal ceremony, held in Moscow with full military honors, was attended by high-ranking officials, military leaders, and representatives from allied nations. Elena, still recovering from her injuries and overwhelmed by the attention, accepted the award with characteristic humility. In her brief acceptance speech, she dedicated the honor to all the soldiers who trusted me with their lives, and to everyone who has ever been told they're too small to make a difference. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Sergei, the veteran medic who had been Elena's final rescue, had survived his injuries and made a full recovery. When he was strong enough to travel, he requested permission to attend Elena's medal ceremony. "Elena saved my life," Sergei told the assembled crowd. "But more than that, she taught me something about the nature of strength. I spent my career thinking that being a good soldier meant being big and tough and intimidating. Elena showed me that real strength comes from refusing to give up, even when everyone tells you that what you're trying to do is impossible." The other 7 soldiers Elena had rescued also attended the ceremony, creating a powerful visual representation of her achievement. These men, who had been written off as casualties of war, were alive because one small woman had refused to accept that their lives couldn't be saved. Elena's story began to have an impact beyond the military sphere. Soviet propaganda highlighted her achievement as an example of how the communist system valued individual merit over traditional social hierarchies. Women throughout the Soviet Union saw Elena as proof that they could succeed in roles traditionally reserved for men. Children, particularly those who had been bullied or dismissed because of their size or appearance, found inspiration in Elena's example. International media also took notice of Elena's story. Allied newspapers ran features about the tiny Soviet hero who had carried soldiers to safety through enemy territory. The story resonated particularly strongly in countries where women were fighting for expanded roles in their own military forces. However, Elena herself remained largely uncomfortable with the attention and fame. She had not undertaken her rescue mission to become a hero or to make a political statement. She had simply been trying to save the lives of wounded soldiers who had been entrusted to her care. The transformation of her actions into a symbol of larger social and political movements sometimes seemed to overshadow the very personal, very human motivations that had driven her. "I didn't set out to prove anything about women or small people or anything else," Elena said in one interview. "I just saw soldiers who needed help, and I was the only person in a position to help them. That's what any decent person would have done." This humility, paradoxically, only enhanced Elena's reputation and influence. Here was someone who had accomplished something extraordinary but refused to see herself as extraordinary. Her matter-of-fact attitude toward her own heroism made her even more inspiring to people who faced their own seemingly impossible challenges. Elena's influence extended into the post-war period as well. She became an advocate for military reforms that would better utilize the capabilities of soldiers who didn't fit traditional physical profiles. She argued for the development of specialized units that could take advantage of soldiers with unique characteristics, small size, unusual agility, specialized skills, rather than trying to force everyone into the same standard mold. The military's Job is to win wars, Elena argued in a speech to Soviet military leadership. If we're going to win wars, we need to use every advantage we can find. Sometimes that advantage comes in an unexpected package. The long-term impact of Elena's story extended far beyond her individual achievement, fundamentally changing how military organizations and society as a whole understood the relationship between physical characteristics and capability. Her rescue mission became a case study taught in military academies around the world, demonstrating how creative thinking and determination could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Elena was offered numerous opportunities to capitalize on her fame. Publishers wanted her to write memoirs, film studios approached her about movie rights, and speaking organizations offered substantial fees for her to tell her story at events across the Soviet Union and beyond. Elena declined most of these opportunities, preferring to return to a relatively quiet life working in military medicine. "I'm not a professional hero," she explained to those who pressed her to take on a more public role. "I'm a medic. My job is to save lives, not to be famous for saving lives." Elena did, however, use her influence to advocate for changes in military policy and training. She worked with Soviet military leadership to develop new training programs that emphasized adaptability and creative problem-solving over pure physical strength. She also pushed for the expansion of roles available to women in the military, arguing that her own experience proved that capability couldn't be determined by traditional physical standards. Her advocacy had measurable results. The Soviet military began recruiting and training soldiers specifically for specialized roles that took advantage of non-traditional physical characteristics. Small-framed soldiers like Elena were trained for reconnaissance and infiltration missions. Soldiers with unusual agility were developed into specialized assault units. The military began to see physical diversity as a strategic advantage rather than a limitation to be overcome. Elena's influence extended into civilian society as well. Her story became part of Soviet educational curriculum, taught to children, as an example of how individual determination could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The lesson wasn't just about physical courage, it was about the importance of refusing to accept other people's limitations on your potential. Years after the war, Elena received letters from people around the world who had been inspired by her story. A young woman in France wrote about how Elena's example had given her the courage to pursue a career in engineering, despite being told that she was too small to work in heavy industry. A man in Britain described how thinking about Elena's determination had helped him overcome a physical disability and complete his medical training. "I realized that if Elena could carry 8 soldiers through enemy territory, then I could certainly handle whatever challenges I was facing," one letter writer explained. "Her story taught me that the only real limitations are the ones we accept for ourselves." Elena's story also had an impact on military medicine specifically. Her innovative carrying techniques and route-finding methods were studied and incorporated into training programs for combat medics. The drainage route she had used became a template for understanding how battlefield terrain could be exploited in ways that weren't immediately obvious to conventional military thinking. More broadly, Elena's achievement contributed to a gradual shift in how societies understood the relationship between gender and capability. While she was careful never to position herself as a feminist activist, her example provided powerful evidence that traditional assumptions about women's limitations were often unfounded. Her story became part of the broader social changes that occurred in many countries during and after World War II. In 1965, 20 years after her famous rescue mission, Elena was invited to speak at the United Nations about the role of women in military service. Her speech, delivered to delegates from around the world, focused not on gender politics, but on the practical importance of utilizing all available human resources in the service of peace and security. "My story isn't really about being a woman or being small," Elena told the assembled delegates. It's about recognizing that capability comes in many different forms, and that our job is to find ways to use every person's unique strengths, rather than forcing everyone to fit the same standard template. Elena continued working in military medicine until her retirement in 1975, eventually rising to the rank of colonel and becoming one of the Soviet Union's leading experts on battlefield medical procedures. She never married, dedicating her life to her work and to mentoring young medics who reminded her of herself, people who were told they were too small, too weak, or too different to succeed in military service. When Elena died in 1995, 50 years after her famous rescue mission, her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by her story. The 8 soldiers she had rescued, those who were still alive, served as honorary pallbearers. Representatives from military organizations around the world attended to pay their respects to a woman who had fundamentally changed how they understood heroism and capability. Elena's grave marker is simple and unadorned, bearing only her name, dates, and the inscription she requested. She carried them to safety. But her legacy lives on in the countless people who have been inspired by her example to refuse to accept limitations imposed by others, to find creative solutions to seemingly impossible problems, and to understand that true strength comes not from physical size but from the determination to do what needs to be done, regardless of the personal cost. Today, Elena Kozlova's story continues to inspire new generations of people who face their own seemingly insurmountable challenges. Her example reminds us that heroism doesn't always come in the package we expect, and that sometimes the people everyone underestimates are exactly the ones who accomplish the impossible. The decades following Elena's heroic rescue mission revealed the true depth of her impact on military doctrine and social understanding of human capability. Her story became more than just a wartime legend. It evolved into a fundamental challenge to how institutions evaluate and utilize human potential. In the 1950s, as the Cold War intensified and military technologies became increasingly sophisticated, Elena found herself at the center of a new kind of battlefield, the intellectual war over military training and recruitment policies. Her rescue mission had proven that unconventional approaches could succeed where traditional methods failed. But implementing this lesson across entire military organizations proved to be a complex challenge. Elena was assigned to a special Soviet military commission tasked with developing new training protocols based on lessons learned during the Great Patriotic War. Her colleagues on this commission included decorated generals, military theorists, and combat veterans who had initially been skeptical of her unconventional methods, but were now eager to understand how her approach could be systematized and taught to others. The problem, Elena explained during one commission meeting, is that we're trying to create a standard program based on something that was fundamentally non-standard. My rescue mission worked because I was able to think outside conventional parameters. If we turn that into a rigid doctrine, we'll lose exactly the flexibility that made it effective. This insight led to one of Elena's most significant contributions to military theory, the development of what became known as adaptive capability assessment. Instead of measuring all soldiers against the same physical and psychological standards, Elena's approach evaluated each individual's unique strengths and then determined how those strengths could be best utilized in military operations. Elena's work with the commission took her to military training facilities across the Soviet Union, where she observed traditional training methods and identified ways they could be modified to better develop individual capabilities. She was particularly interested in soldiers who, like herself, didn't fit standard profiles but possessed unique characteristics that could be valuable in specialized roles. At a training facility in Siberia, Elena encountered a young soldier named Viktor Petrov who had been struggling with conventional infantry training. Victor was exceptionally thin and appeared physically weak by traditional military standards, leading his instructors to consider him unsuitable for combat roles. However, Elena noticed that Victor had remarkable endurance and an unusual ability to remain calm under stress. "Victor," Elena said after observing his training for several days, "show me how you would approach this obstacle course if you were trying to complete it as quickly as possible, without worrying about doing it the correct way." Victor's unconventional approach to the obstacle course, using his light weight and flexibility to find shortcuts that heavier soldiers couldn't manage, impressed Elena and demonstrated her point about the value of individual adaptation. Under Elena's mentorship, Victor eventually became a highly effective reconnaissance specialist, using his unique physical characteristics to gather intelligence in situations where conventional soldiers would have been detected. Elena's influence extended beyond individual cases to broader questions of military organization. She argued that the Soviet military's emphasis on creating uniform, standardized units was potentially limiting its effectiveness by failing to take advantage of the natural diversity in human capabilities. "We spend enormous effort trying to make all soldiers the same," Elena wrote in an influential military journal article, "when we should be celebrating and utilizing the ways they're different." A military force composed entirely of identical soldiers might look impressive on parade, but it will be less effective in actual combat than a force that can adapt to diverse and unexpected situations. This philosophy put Elena at odds with some traditional military leaders who believed that standardization and uniformity were essential for maintaining discipline and coordination. The debate between Elena's adaptive capability approach and more conventional military doctrine became a significant topic of discussion in Soviet military circles throughout the 1950s. Elena's position was strengthened by continuing to demonstrate the practical value of her approach. She personally trained dozens of soldiers who had been considered unsuitable for military service, helping them find roles where their unique characteristics became advantages rather than limitations. Her success rate with these problem soldiers was remarkably high, with many going on to distinguished military careers and specialized roles. One of Elena's most successful students was Maria Volkov, a young woman who had been rejected from military service because of her extremely small stature, even smaller than Elena herself. Under Elena's guidance, Maria developed techniques for infiltration and sabotage that took advantage of her ability to access spaces that were impossible for larger operatives. Maria's successful completion of several high-risk intelligence missions during the Cold War validated Elena's belief that physical limitations could often be transformed into tactical advantages. Elena's work during this period also involved extensive writing and teaching. She authored several military training manuals that emphasized adaptability and creative problem-solving over rigid adherence to standard procedures. Her writing style was characteristically direct and practical, focusing on concrete techniques rather than abstract theories. "The goal is not to be impressive," Elena wrote in her most widely read manual, Military Medicine in Unconventional Situations. "The goal is to be effective." Sometimes being effective means doing things that look wrong to people who are more concerned with appearances than results. Elena's training methods were gradually adopted by military organizations beyond the Soviet Union. NATO countries, initially reluctant to learn from Soviet military doctrine, eventually recognized the value of Elena's adaptive approach and began incorporating similar principles into their own training programs. Elena's influence on military thinking extended far beyond the specific techniques she had developed. She had fundamentally changed how military leaders thought about human potential and capability. By the late 1950s, Elena had achieved something remarkable. She had transformed from a wartime hero into a peacetime innovator whose ideas were reshaping military doctrine across multiple countries. Her rescue mission had been the dramatic proof of concept, but her subsequent work provided the systematic foundation that allowed her insights to be applied on a much larger scale. Elena's influence during the 1960s and 1970s extended far beyond military circles as her story became part of broader social movements challenging traditional assumptions about gender, physical capability, and social roles. However, Elena herself remained focused on practical applications of her insights, rather than becoming involved in political activism. In 1962, Elena was invited to address the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva, Switzerland. This was her first major international speaking engagement, and it provided her with a platform to discuss how her military medical experience could be applied to civilian emergency response and disaster relief operations. The principles that guided my rescue mission during the war, Elena told the assembled delegates, are equally applicable to civilian emergency situations. The key is to focus on what needs to be done rather than on conventional approaches that may not be suitable for unusual circumstances. Elena's presentation included detailed case studies of how her adaptive approach to emergency medicine had been successfully applied in various civilian contexts. She described situations where traditional emergency response methods had failed, but where creative application of unconventional techniques had saved lives. One particularly compelling example involved a mining accident in the Ural Mountains, where conventional rescue equipment had been unable to reach trapped miners due to the confined space and unstable conditions. Elena had trained a team of small-statured rescue workers who were able to access the trapped miners using techniques similar to those she had developed during her wartime drainage system rescues. The miners were saved not because we had better equipment or more resources, Elena explained, but because we were willing to think differently about the problem and use the human resources we had in ways that conventional rescue doctrine wouldn't have considered. Elena's international presentation was well received and led to invitations to consult on emergency response planning in several countries. She worked with organizations in earthquake-prone regions of Japan, flood-prone areas of the Netherlands, and mountainous rescue services in Switzerland, helping them develop response capabilities that could function effectively in situations where conventional approaches might fail. During this period, Elena also began mentoring a new generation of military medical personnel who were interested in applying her methods to modern combat situations. The nature of warfare was changing rapidly during the Cold War era, with new technologies and tactical approaches creating challenges that hadn't existed during World War II. One of Elena's most promising students was Captain Sarah Mitchell, an American military medic who had requested permission to study Elena's methods as part of a NATO exchange program. Captain Mitchell was particularly interested in how Elena's techniques might be adapted for use in jungle warfare, where dense vegetation and difficult terrain created challenges similar to those Elena had faced in the drainage systems. The specific techniques Elena used were designed for her particular situation, Captain Mitchell observed after completing her training, but the underlying principles, adaptability, creative problem-solving, and using individual strengths rather than fighting individual limitations, are universally applicable. Captain Mitchell went on to develop jungle rescue techniques that incorporated Elena's principles, successfully using them during combat operations in Vietnam. Her success led to broader adoption of Elena's methods by American Special Forces, demonstrating that Elena's influence was continuing to evolve and expand decades after her original rescue mission. Elena's impact during this period wasn't limited to military and emergency response applications. Her story had become a powerful symbol for various social movements, particularly those focused on expanding opportunities for women and people with physical differences. However, Elena was careful to maintain her focus on practical applications, rather than becoming a political symbol. When asked by journalists about her views on women's liberation movements, Elena typically redirected the conversation toward specific techniques and capabilities rather than broader social questions. "I'm not qualified to speak about social movements," Elena would say, "but I can tell you that in my experience, capability is much more important than fitting into traditional categories. If someone can do a job effectively, then their gender or size or any other characteristic shouldn't matter." This pragmatic approach actually enhanced Elena's influence within social movements, as her example provided concrete evidence that traditional limitations were often unfounded, without requiring her to become involved in political controversies that might have reduced her credibility with military and emergency response organizations. Elena's work during this period also involved extensive collaboration with medical researchers who were interested in understanding the physiological and psychological factors that had enabled her extraordinary performance during the rescue mission. These studies provided scientific validation for many of Elena's insights about human capability and adaptability. Dr. James Harrison, a British physiologist who studied Elena's case in detail, published research demonstrating that her small size had provided significant advantages in terms of energy efficiency, heat regulation, and oxygen consumption during extended physical exertion. His work showed that Elena's success hadn't been despite her physical characteristics, but because of how those characteristics were suited to the specific demands of her mission. Elena's case demonstrates that we need to think much more carefully about matching human capabilities to task requirements, Dr. Harrison wrote in his landmark study. Traditional assumptions about physical capability are often based on general rather than specific performance requirements. This scientific validation of Elena's approach provided additional credibility for her training methods and helped accelerate their adoption by various organizations. Elena herself was pleased that her intuitive understanding of capability optimization was being supported by rigorous scientific research. "I always knew that my approach worked," Elena said in response to Dr. Harrison's research, "but it's gratifying to understand why it worked. That scientific understanding makes it much easier to teach these principles to others." By the mid-1970s, Elena had achieved something unprecedented. She had successfully transitioned from wartime hero to peacetime innovator, continuing to influence military doctrine, emergency response procedures, and social understanding of human capability more than 30 years after her original rescue mission. As Elena entered the final decades of her career in the 1980s and early 1990s, her influence had evolved from that of an individual hero to that of an institutional reformer whose ideas had fundamentally changed how organizations approached human resource utilization and capability development. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 created new opportunities for Elena to share her insights with a broader international audience. Previously, much of her work had been limited to Soviet military and allied organizations due to Cold War restrictions. With these barriers removed, Elena found herself in demand as a consultant and speaker throughout the former Soviet bloc and Western countries. One of Elena's most significant projects during this period was her collaboration with the newly formed Russian Federation military to develop training programs that would help the organization transition from Soviet-era practices to more flexible, adaptive approaches suitable for post-Cold War security challenges. "The world has changed dramatically since my rescue mission in 1941, Elena observed during a planning meeting for the new training programs. But the fundamental principles using individual strengths, thinking creatively about problems, and refusing to accept conventional limitations are more relevant than ever." Elena's work with the Russian military during this transition period demonstrated her ability to adapt her principles to changing circumstances while maintaining their essential character. The new training program she helped develop emphasized flexibility, individual initiative, and creative problem-solving qualities that would prove essential for military operations in the complex, multifaceted conflicts of the post-Cold War era. Elena also used this period to mentor a final generation of students who would carry her principles forward into the 21st century. Among these students was Lieutenant Colonel Anna Petrov, no relation to the Viktor Petrov Elena had trained decades earlier, who would go on to apply Elena's methods during humanitarian operations in the Balkans and other conflict zones. Elena taught me that the most important question isn't whether you're strong enough or big enough or conventional enough to do something. Lieutenant Colonel Petrov explained years later. The most important question is whether you're creative enough and determined enough to find a way to get it done. During the early 1990s, Elena also began working on what would become her most enduring contribution to military and emergency response doctrine, a comprehensive manual titled Adaptive Response: Principles of Unconventional Problem-Solving in High-Stress Situations. This manual distilled 5 decades of Elena's experience into practical guidance that could be applied across a wide range of challenging circumstances. The manual's core principles were deceptively simple but profoundly challenging to conventional thinking. First, assess situations based on actual requirements rather than standard assumptions. Elena argued that most organizational failures occurred because people applied standard solutions to non-standard problems without carefully analyzing what the situation actually required. Second, inventory available resources based on actual capabilities rather than conventional roles. Elena's rescue mission had succeeded partly because she recognized that her small size was actually an advantage for the specific challenges she faced, rather than the general disadvantage it appeared to be in conventional military contexts. Third, develop solutions that utilize individual strengths rather than attempting to overcome individual limitations. Elena had consistently demonstrated that extraordinary results could be achieved by working with human characteristics rather than against them. Fourth, maintain flexibility and adaptability throughout implementation. Elena emphasized that even the best plans needed to be modified based on changing circumstances and unexpected challenges. Fifth, focus on results rather than process. Elena argued that organizations often became so focused on following correct procedures that they lost sight of whether those procedures were actually achieving desired outcomes. These principles, while developed from Elena's military experience, proved to be widely applicable across various fields. Business organizations began using Elena's manual to improve their problem-solving and crisis management capabilities. Emergency response agencies adopted her methods for dealing with unusual disaster scenarios. Even educational institutions found value in Elena's approach to helping students with non-traditional learning styles succeed in academic environments. Elena's final major project was the establishment of the Kozlova Institute for Adaptive Capability Development in Moscow. This institution, founded in 1993 with support from both Russian government agencies and international organizations, was designed to continue Elena's work of developing and teaching adaptive problem-solving methods. The institute became a center for research and training that attracted students and researchers from around the world. Elena personally taught courses at the institute until she was well into her 70s, continuing to demonstrate the techniques and principles she had developed over her remarkable career. One of Elena's last major speaking engagements was at the Institute's inaugural international conference in 1994. Her keynote address, titled 50 Years of Adaptive Problem Solving, provided a comprehensive overview of how her wartime rescue mission had evolved into a systematic approach to human capability development. When I carried those 8 soldiers through enemy territory in 1941, Elena told the assembled audience, I thought I was simply doing what needed to be done in that particular moment. I had no idea that the experience would lead to a lifetime of discovering how much more capable people are than we usually assume them to be. Elena concluded her address with characteristic humility and practical focus. The real lesson of my story isn't that I was especially heroic or capable. The real lesson is that all of us have capabilities we haven't discovered yet, and that our job, whether as individuals or as organizations, is to create circumstances where those capabilities can emerge and be utilized effectively. Elena Kozlova died peacefully in her sleep on March 15, 1995, just 2 months after her 74th birthday. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives and careers had been influenced by her example and teachings. The 8 soldiers she had rescued during World War II, those who were still alive, served as honorary pallbearers, completing a circle that had begun more than 50 years earlier in a muddy bunker under enemy fire. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.